Well, hello. I'm Mike Zeller. I'm the assistant director at the Shrewsbury Public Library in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. And I'm really happy to be joining you here for a few minutes today. So, libraries have always been a very important part of my life. My mom likes to tell a story about how when I was a child, I was actually tossed out of the story time, the first story time event I went to as a little kid because I was being disruptive. And she said she knew right from that moment on that I was destined to be a librarian. Obviously, as a librarian, libraries are very, very important to me for uh, survival. But more than that, I think they're just such a vital resource for our communities. I mean, they're really one of the few things left in our society that is just there to help people. Libraries aren't making money. They're not trying to sell anything. They're not trying to win people over to a particular viewpoint. They're literally just there to help people get through their days, and it's always been very meaningful to me to have that be, what I'm spending most of my day doing. Um, in the United States, it really is, the library is really a singular institution in that way. So I was asked to read something to you all today. I'm going to be reading a very short selection from a work in progress that I'm doing right now, which is I've tentatively titled "Star in the Darkness." That's a working title and will probably change. It's about an unnamed man who's venturing through a kind of dark fantasy landscape, um, trying to find someone or something. It's very um, dreamlike, fairy tale like. So in this particular section, the man has just fallen asleep, fallen into a fitful sleep after traveling with a very odd companion for most of the day. Um, so the man found himself standing in what appeared to be an art gallery. It was a large open room with white walls upon which hung a series of paintings every few yards. Feeling a slight pressure on his right arm, he looked down to see the tall, dark-skinned woman from his dream lightly leaning against him. She wore an elegant-looking black jacket, and her long dark hair had been woven into an ornate braid which was flipped over her right shoulder. As he gazed at her, she looked up at him and smiled. "This one always makes me think of you," she said, motioning with her head. He turned and saw they stood before a large canvas adorned with a lone peak rising high amongst a range of mountains, a blanket of snow and ice draped across its craggy surface. Its crest uh, its crest was adorned with what appeared to be an ancient stone tower that projected even further into the gray, overcast sky. The artist's skill was considerable, and the man could almost feel himself stepping forward, his boots crunching into the snow as he ascended the mountain's heights. The man gazed upon the painting in silence for a time, and when his companion finally spoke, he struggled to tell whether the question was asked by her or by the image itself. "What does it make you feel?" Again he silently contemplated the mountain, viewing it intently for several moments before answering, "Alone." The woman laughed lightly, her voice like a finger sliding along a viol string. "Hopefully not too alone," she said, giving his arm a playful squeeze. She released him then, passing behind him to view other pieces on the wall to his left. As he continued to gaze upon the painting, new details continued to emerge. Lower down the mountain, the wind whipped up a massive cloud of ice crystals that twisted about in the air like the arms of a dancer caught up in the reverie of the music. Higher still, a lone boulder sat poised as if at any moment it would come crashing down the cliffs, bringing with it a cacophony of rocks and clumps of snow. And midway up, the way the light and shadow played amongst the crags, it almost appeared as if a lone, dark figure was making its way up, slowly trudging through the inhospitable landscape towards the tower at the top. Eventually, the man managed to pull his eyes away from the image and look about for his companion. He no longer saw her, but near where she had last been standing was a hallway leading into an adjacent room of the gallery, so he headed that way. But she wasn't in that room either. A handful of nondescript people milled about, viewing paintings of ships tossed about on the waves, wild, overgrown jungles, and the like, but the dark-skinned woman was nowhere to be seen. A tiny mote of fear began to creep up from the recesses of his mind, but he immediately pushed it back down and walked through an archway into the next room. But she wasn't there either, or in the room that followed. He stopped in its center and gazed about himself in confusion. It had only been mere moments since she had left his side. Surely she could not have gone so far. The seed of fear he had felt quickly sprouted, its roots twisting through the wrinkles of his brain, turning his stomach and tightening his chest. How careless of him to misplace something so important. The man whirled at the voice behind him to spy two figures standing in the archway he had just passed through. It was Peter, still clad in his worn patchwork armor, leaning nonchalantly against his upright spear and idly picking at his teeth with the pinky finger of one hand. Next to him stood Songbird, dressed in her feathered armor and cloak, her pristine, elegant attire a sharp contrast to Peter's sloppily cobbled-together appearance. Her face was a mask of neutrality as she stared at the man with her dark, piercing eyes. He felt a jolt go through him at the sight of her, but any thoughts of a reunion were quickly overwhelmed by his urgent need to find his missing companion. You know, for someone who pretends to be so single-minded and focused, he really is something of a scatterbrain, wouldn't you say? Peter said again, seeming to address Songbird. As was to be expected, she made no reply, and continued to simply stare at the man in the same dispassionate way she had when they had last parted. If Peter felt insulted by her silence, he gave no indication, and in fact his bored expression shifted to one of amusement. "You better hurry up and find her quick, or who knows what might happen." The man felt his jaw clench in anger, and he quickly turned back to his task. Not finding the woman in this room, he walked rapidly into the next, and hurriedly scanned it for her lithe, dark form. Again, nothing. Panic began to take hold now, and he practically sprinted into the next room of the gallery, and the next, and the next. Honestly, it's just disappointing, really. Peter and Songbird once again stood in the archway behind him. Peter sighed and shook his head, his face a mixture of pity and resignation. I had expected so much more from him. The man felt his face burn in shame, but he had no time for Peter's mockery. Perhaps she had doubled back, the man thought, and in his haste the pair had inadvertently passed one another. Peter and Songbird stepped aside as the man bolted back into the way he had come, dashing through one room after another. But for some reason, the paintings looked unfamiliar now, and the archways between rooms seemed to be in different places. He tried to recall the path he had taken from the painting of the mountain, but his thoughts were clouded and muddled. Before he knew it, his sense of direction failed him, and he was utterly lost. Eventually, he found himself standing in the midst of a completely unknown room, the paintings mere dark blotches on the wall as he spun about in a frenzied attempt to orient himself. I suppose he's just a lost cause. The man whirled about to find Peter and Songbird once more standing in an archway behind him. Peter sighed heavily before drawing a small book from a pouch on his belt and beginning to scribble something into it with a small pencil he had tucked behind one ear. Songbird, meanwhile, continued to stare at him with her same emotionless expression. But the more the man looked into her dark brown eyes, the more he sensed an aching sadness radiating from them. Down the shadowed wells of her irises, deep in the core of her being, a feeling of loss rose up like a fine mist to envelop him. Part of him longed to breathe it in, to allow himself to be part of that mournful kinship. But as at the campfire, at the moment he felt himself sink into the warm embrace of their shared pain, he repulsed it, for to acknowledge their bond would be to truly accept his own loss. Songbird abruptly broke her gaze, shattering the agonizing communion the man was struggling to reject. Her eyes now focused on something just behind him, and he slowly turned to follow them. There, on the wall which had been bare mere seconds ago, was an enormous painting, its canvas nearly 6 feet wide and extending from floor to ceiling, seeming to swallow up the entire side of the room. Unlike most of the other pieces he had seen throughout the gallery, which seemed to embrace a kind of classical realism, This one was a complete abstraction, the canvas a school of powerful red and orange strokes swimming about in an ocean of blackness. Despite its simplicity, or perhaps because of it, no other image he had seen was nearly as evocative. Its rawness conjured flames for him like no photorealistic painting of a campfire or a torch possibly could. He could practically feel the heat radiating from the canvas, and something about that terrified him. But despite that fear, he found himself drawing closer to the painting, his hand reaching out towards it even as the heat grew more and more intense. He could see a dark figure in it now, wreathed in the flames, and his outstretched fingers moved slowly towards it. The instant he touched the painting, a scorching agony shot through his arm, burning away flesh, muscle, and bone. In that instant, he heard a woman scream. So that's it for me. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my reading, and best wishes to all of you.